Now, with Final Fantasy X-2, I really feel it's important to start with something that's going to sound a bit like a rant, but it's something that does have to be established first. So, whenever I post this, I'm going to make an effort to put a little timestamp saying, "Here's where the actual review starts," for anybody who just wants to skip to that part. FF102 is a beautiful example of what I call the fine line between entitlement and expectation and truth in advertising. Okay, I kind of want to just jump into this, so I guess I will just do so. A lot of us watched that movie, The Eternal Calm, after FF10 came out, and a lot of us really enjoyed the setting of FF10. As I mentioned back in my FF10 review, there was so much going on, and there was so much subtlety, there was so much potential, there was so much complexity in the game, that the concept of taking all of that, all of those massive, extreme defining features, and then abruptly stopping them just like that, was what I like to call potential incarnate. I was so psyched. Now, of course, I do have to also admit I was very much enjoying the idea of an actual sequel. I have always been one of those people who enjoys the concept of canon and continuity. There's a reason why every story I've ever written, yes, all of them, all connect in some way or another. They're all part of the same canon, right? And so back in the day, I used to actually have a way where the FFs all tied in, which is funny because now, with the remakes and the re-releases coming out, they have actually started tying them in small ways. But anyways, the bottom line is a genuine sequel to an FF, even if it was FF10, which, as I've said, I do think was a good game, just not an amazing or fantastic or perfect game, was something I was really looking forward to. But again, even ignoring the sequel concept, which I do think is important to note, everything I said about back in the FF10 review, everything about the setting, about this entire societally and culturally structured civilization, which has become so ground down and so stagnant over a millennium, suddenly and abruptly, without any real warning, without any knowledge or because no, everybody knew Yuna was going on a pilgrimage, but they figured it would just be another calm, just like all the other summoners formed a calm. For the eternal calm to come out was just, well, and it literally was out of nowhere. Nobody was prepped, nobody was ready, and so what you have is this massive mess, basically. But from a storytelling perspective, that mess is like if you really like Legos, okay, bear with me, and you buy those prefab things, and you put them together and you follow the directions, blah blah blah, and one day you're like, ah, God, I really wish I could do something with that, and you open the door to your room, and the room is just filled with Legos, lots of them, all types, all varieties, all colors. If you want a white long strip that's 2 by 5, it's there, it was just yes. There's so much you can do with that. It was a blank canvas. Now, the mere fact that I am reviewing this game, for anybody who remembers my rules, means that I do think this is a net positive. I do enjoy this game. The fact that there is 159 hours on my save game probably attests to that. And I'll get into the whys and the wheres and the hows of that later. But this preamble really is important to understand my viewpoint on this game, okay? Let me start with an analogy. Or rather, this isn't actually an analogy, this is a direct comparison. Rather recently, a game came out. Now, it's one of the only games I've purchased this year. In fact, I think I've only purchased 4 games total this year, if you count Pandaria as one of those. Um, and this was one of them. This is one that had so much consumer trust. This is something I've talked about before when I was discussing Mass Effect. There was so much consumer trust built up in this brand, in this series, that I was just like, yep, done, sold. I didn't even have to think about it. I had it pre-ordered months in advance. And the game came out, and I started playing it, and something was very off, pretty much right from the get-go. And I got quite a ways into it, and while I was enjoying myself, while the game was good, it never actually raised above good, which is very odd for a series that, in my opinion, has always been in the art category. Is some of my favorite games of all time, and for a lot of good reasons. And so, I was trying to put my finger on it, and I finally realized the problem was it wasn't a part of that series. They had basically lied to me. All that consumer trust had been betrayed. Now, while the game was still good, it was not of that series. Now, I'm going to go ahead and stop dancing around the topic. I've been wondering how many people would figure it out by now. I'm talking about Paper Mario Sticker Star. I have been a fan of the Mario RPG, starting from SMRPG, going through the Paper Marios, and hitting the Game Boy games with the Mario and Luigi series. I have been a fan of that series since the beginning. It is my opinion that that series of games is absolutely amazing. So much of what I think of now of the Mario setting, of the characters, of the personalities thereof for everyone, comes from those games. I mean, the mere fact that everything I know and think about Bowser basically comes 100% from those games and not from the actual Mario games probably says something. And yeah, I could keep going, but I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I don't want to gush about another series. I'm talking about FF here, or at least I will be in a minute. But when I think of Paper Mario, what immediately occurred to me was several things. Number one, an excellent story. Number two, good characterization. And admittedly, I want to stress that my characterization for Mario has is basically entirely comes from the Mario RPG series, and that's really impressive for a character who never talks. But that speaks to the quality of the games. Paper Mario 2, the Thousand Year Door on the GameCube, is probably the pinnacle of this series, and I know many people who agree with me on that. They actually managed to characterize and have everyone grow and show and really go in depth, not just in the story, but on the NPC level, to such a degree, you know? So, characterization, I'm sorry, plot, good story, characterization, the setting is usually engaging. I would actually say always engaging, but that's my opinion. You know, the setting is something that at least has caught my interest. You know, and again, Paper Mario 2 would be the poster child of this. And finally, it has a really kind of dorky, silly humor to it. Okay, now I mentioned this importantly because this is going to come up in this FF10 review. But the type of humor that the Mario RPG series has is what I tend to call the Dragon Quest type humor, which is very kind of tongue-in-cheek bad humor, you know, and there's a lot of puns and stuff like that, and I do admittedly get into that. I'll talk about that more in depth later, but I just want to mention that this is what a Mario RPG is, right? This is Paper Mario Sticker Star. Actually, more like this, about halfway up there. Now, like I said, I don't want to get into a full review of that game. I could, but in summary, if you take a game whose entire series to a single individual game has been defined by four powerful, strong qualities that I enjoy, and take away, what would that be? That would be 7/8 ish of it. It's not that series anymore. It's not a Paper Mario. That is my problem with this game. Paper Mario Sticker Star is not a Paper Mario game, and I've thought it long and hard. It is actually a Mario game. It is a plain old Mario, or just Mario, you know, like Mario 64 or whatnot. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that when you get down to it. And as I said, it isn't a bad game. But I was deceived, right? Now, the argument has been made, and I just feel like pointing this out because this will be relevant to 10.2 as well, that you should have looked into it more. To which I reply, for anybody like me out there, and I know there's plenty of you, we don't want the game to be spoiled before we pick it up. I'm one of those people who went to see The Matrix in the theaters and had no idea what I was walking into. None. It looked like an interesting, superhuman action flick. When the first moment happened, when they revealed what The Matrix was and he came out of the pod, I was floored. I like that. I like being floored. I like being surprised. I admittedly have to kind of turn my brain off when I'm enjoying movies and video games because it's so easy for me to guess what's going to happen. But I do like having the experience as it goes rather than knowing everything in advance. And anybody out there who knows that developers and advertising companies and publishers tend to give away basically everything. No, not always everything, but certainly quite a lot well before the game comes out, and certainly enough to start making educated guesses. So my response to that argument is, I don't want to look into it. I acknowledge that there is a risk involved with that because I do have to basically put my trust in something that is ultimately coming from a corporation, which ultimately, let's be honest, should not have my trust. But that's why trust is built up over time. This Paper Mario series is not new, and neither was Final Fantasy. The obvious point I'm getting to here is the fact that FF10-2 was an example of, in my opinion, of this exact same fallacy. That the trust that several people, myself included, put in the Final Fantasy series and name was violated. The only advert, the only preamble to FF102 I ever saw was the Eternal Calm, that little short video. And by the way, if you haven't watched that, if you have any interest in the FF10 or 10.2, I strongly recommend it. Just YouTube FF10 Eternal Calm or just the Eternal Calm, something like that. And you should be able to find it. It's going to be a little low quality because, duh. But I do recommend it. Anyways, that was all I had to go off of. So I walked into FF102, and I distinctly recall sitting in my in a friend of mine's room, actually, because we were playing on his PS2, because he really wanted to, and firing it up. And the very first thing is this. I'm trying really hard not to use unpleasant words. I really am. I'm not talking about cussing. I want to call it an abomination. Looking back, I can be more kind, but at the time, my jaw dropped. Seeing the little dance sequence, seeing the J-pop start up, seeing these girls in skimpy outfits bouncing around like idiots, and I honestly thought, because this is something that had started happening at about that time in video gaming history, I honestly thought we had gotten the wrong game, if you know what I mean. That the CD had been mislabeled or something. But no, this was actually FF102. Now, the main reason I feel like all of this has to be put out first is because that... First of all, I'm very against that. I was against that with Mass Effect. I was against that with Paper Mario, which just happened. I was against that with FF102. These are not the only examples. I'm not going to go into details. I don't want to get into it, because there's actually quite a few examples of this happening. People would argue as well that some other games that I probably wouldn't mention are part of this list as well, because, let's be honest, this is a little bit of an opinion thing. Here, let me give you one more example. Just one. There's a game that here in the States came out called Final Fantasy Adventure. It was called that because the Final Fantasy name was big over here in the States at the time. This game, for anybody of you out there who actually knows, is actually Seiken Densetsu 1, or Sword of Mana, if you prefer that translation, the beginning of the Secret of Mana series, to put it plainly, or the Seiken Densetsu series, if you prefer. Now, that was a good game, but it wasn't a Final Fantasy. In fact, it was very not Final Fantasy, and a lot of people, myself included, felt a little bit agitated at the time. Now, I'm glad I got into that series, and so you could argue one way or another on this, because I'm really a big fan of the Seiken Densetsu series, and I wish they'd... But the point is, this is not a new thing, and every time it happens, that trust takes a significant hit, because, at least in my opinion, and again, I know I'm not alone in this kind of consumer trust that I have been talking about this whole time, that I talked about with Mass Effect, that I talked about with so many other games, builds slowly. You come out with 3 excellent games, and then have one game that completely betrays that trust, you're basically back at zero, if you follow what I'm saying. Now, that may sound unkind, but you have to keep in mind our perspective, the consumer's perspective, of the fact that this is ultimately something that's coming from a company that is out for money. Now, I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with that. What I am saying is, as several people pointed out in opposition to my analogy once upon a time, it is different to place trust in an individual than it is to put trust in a corporation, or a brand name, or whatever, right? Or team. That's another good one. So, my point is, this is a big, massive gray area, is really what I'm trying to get down to. And anytime that trust is violated, and this is probably the first time Square really let me down. In fact, it is the first time Square really let me down, and which would begin a trend. Nowadays, I think of Square Enix, and I want to spit. And I mean that sincerely. I have been a defender of FF13. I have. But I still want to punch Yoichi Wada in the balls 20 times, because that man is making so many stupid choices that is destroying so much potential and possibility that I am just begging for. I'm getting off on a tangent. My point is, when that trust is betrayed, when you have the product in front of you and ready to go, you have 2 choices. You can tough it out, or you can return it, right? Sometimes returning it isn't that easy, especially in this modern day and age. However, at the time, we decided to tough it out. Now, I am glad I did. I really am. I did enjoy FF102. But the point that has to be made immediately and most powerfully, that because it colors absolutely everything else about the game, is that it is not a Final Fantasy. I'm sorry. I liked Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I'm one of the only people who do. I've gone on record saying that, okay? I liked Final Fantasy Adventure. I like Final Fantasy X too. None of these 3 games are Final Fantasies. They aren't. Now, once that obstacle has been overcome, then we could start looking at the game and being like, okay, let's actually look at the game. So I'm going to start referring to this as 10-2 henceforth, because that is what I've been referring it to for many years, and I've been trying to catch myself as I've started here to call it FF or Final Fantasy X-2. 10-2 is a game that I feel was an attempt to broaden the audience of Square Enix, really, to try to increase their consumer base. I think it failed, personally, but that's because there was quite a bit of a backlash at the result of this game. However, it is worth noting that the opinion of it gets good after a while, or once you overcome the problems it's a decent game, is one that I have seen and heard many times. And while I'm going to try and go into a little more detail than that, that is basically the summary of my opinion right here. It really isn't a bad game. My biggest problems with the game I'm going to go over with really quick here, and I'm going to try and barrel through these, because again, I don't want to get too negative. The villain was pathetic. I'm sorry. Shuyin was not an interesting antagonist. In my opinion, they should have gone one of two directions with it, both of which are in opposite directions of where they actually were here, right? The idea of a love that is so powerful that lasts for a millennia, that conquers all, that is ready to move planets forward, that's the kind of thing I can get behind. It is. But you have to, A, have that prepared from the beginning, B, craft it very carefully, and C, make sure that the people who are viewing this understand that this is love, not infatuation. Now, I use that distinction because, speaking as someone who has been around the block a couple of times, I remember what it was like. I remember how it felt when I was much, much younger and infatuated with someone. And now, at the time, I had no frame of reference, right? So I'm not saying, anybody out there who is young or has been infatuated, I'm not trying to put you down any more than I'm trying to put myself down. This is something human beings go through. We learn what love is over time. We gain experience, we gain knowledge, we gain in wisdom, and we try to get better at it. And as more layers are added to the gradient, we begin to understand that love isn't blung. It's more like this. It's this whole array here, and it's a very complicated thing. But to have a mature, understanding love is something that it takes a while to get used to what that concept is, and you can do that in a story, and some people do that very well in a story, in my opinion. This game, I was going to say the FFs have done this several times well, in my opinion. I've used FF6 as an example of that. The Celis and Locke story, I think, was a good love story. Honestly, I think the way Rosa and Cecil were handled was well done. Shuyin and Len were kids who were infatuated. Now, one of the reasons I say this is because we have to infer such things, because we aren't these people, obviously, and they aren't real people, so we can't be like, hey, Shuyin, No, we have to infer this by their tone, which in this case is irrelevant because there are voice acting, and admittedly, voice acting might have been part of the problem, but tone and word choice, that's important, and the way it is presented within the frame of the story. And all three of these things, which I'm not going to go into complete detail on, but if you just analyze it and break it down, it is very clear. Shuyin was her boyfriend, not the love of her life. Len was his girlfriend, not the love of his life. The two of these people probably did care about each other, probably did feel something that could be quantified as love for each other, but it was not love. And so rather than love moving and conquering and causing all this horror, we have what comes across as frankly childish, as this sort of angsty thing. Now, I've heard some people argue against this, and they've made some good points, which I will not address in detail here, because my point has always defeated them in return. The entire game has that feel to it. The entire story, I should say, the entire presentation of it, the art design, the directing design, the word choice, and all the script and all the writing, the way every character doesn't grow, basically. There's some character growth in this game, but the way all the characters are portrayed, everything in this game points to being more childish. Now, I think they did that on purpose, personally. I think that this was a deliberate attempt to contrast the dreary dread and the sheer mind and soul and heart-numbingly deadening setting of FF10 with this much more chipper, upbeat setting of 10-2, right? I think they should have done it a different way, but that's just me. But my point is, Shuyin as a villain failed miserably. is what I'm getting down to. It was more interesting when we thought it was Nuge, or the other guy whose name I can't even remember right now. So that's my first complaint. My second complaint, which I guess I already voiced, is that the whole game just feels, ah, you know. And again, I could have at least. Oh, I'm sorry, I never finished my point, did I? The other direction they could have gone in was basically more. It feels like they were trying to have a serious story within a children's cartoon. Okay, that can be done. I've seen it done. It's difficult to do, and anybody. I mean, far be it for me to posit the theory that you should just go with whatever you know, but the team who was working on 10.2 was still relatively new to the concept of working on games like this in general. Now, I say relatively new because they had a few under their belt, but if you'll recall in my journey through the FFs, I talked about the differences between the old guard and the new guard, and the changes they wanted to make, and the experimental ways they wanted to go in. And it is my belief, because I don't actually have data on this one, that this is what 10.2 was. They were trying to branch out into a new direction, and I think they failed. But if they had, in my opinion, if they had either reined it in or gone further, really gone to the innocence and the naivete that when we think of childishness, we tend to think of two things, in my experience. There's the negative and the positive, really. You know, the positive is the innocence, the naivete, the childlike wonder, right? The negative is childishness. You know, that's something we tend to use as a negative. I have, in fact, myself used that as an insult because we're referring to someone who is being bratty or selfish or not thinking in the long term or anything like that, right? If they had really embraced this side over here, that childlike glee, that wonder, that concept of a new era, rather than a bunch of kids running around complaining a bunch, I think 10.2 would have succeeded a lot more, personally. That is just my opinion, of course. One of my other big problems with the game is well, I guess I kind of already mentioned this, the basic lack of characterization. Yuna had a little bit of character growth during the game. Pain, I would argue that isn't character growth, but I will admit that it's more a detail of semantics. But the reason I argue that is because I think what happened with Pain was character assassination. One of the things that I've talked about, and this is a literary concept whose name I don't know, is the concept of what I like to call a backdrop. In Dragon Age, for example, and I mentioned this, uh, shoot, I suddenly can't think of their names. The evil guys, the zombie things. I can't think of their names. Whatever, you know who I'm talking about. Were served as a backdrop because they were, and the whole point of a backdrop is for it to be static, flat, right? In fact, actually, you know what? I can explain really easily here. You want? Okay, you see this? Ignoring this white strip over here, just this part of the cardboard. While there is some detail here, this is very flat. This is very linear. This is very static. So you can use this, and so when you put something else in front of it, even though my hand is nice and straight and simple here, and this appears to be, for example, a villain in the villain case, this appears to be evil. If you really look at the hand, you see that the grooves, you see the colorations of the skin, you see the fact that there's paling going on there, and you can see some of my veins. My point is there are details, there are subtleties that this lacks. Auron in FF10 provided that type of a character. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Quite the contrary, I liked Auron a lot. But one of the things he serviced was to be a backdrop character. Auron didn't change throughout the course of the game that we saw. We saw that he did change over the course of the story, because we saw how he used to be. But in the game proper, Auron stayed the same, specifically to provide a backdrop for the main characters. Pain was that for about the first third of the game. And it was working rather well, I thought. I actually was rather enjoying the character. And then they stopped, and they did something that I'm not sure what exactly they were thinking. I do have a theory, which I'll get into next. But Pain started being like the other two girls, basically. Not completely, of course, because Riku was just, wah! But, point being that Pain stopped being that, and it feels like it was an attempt at characterization or character growth, but it came off flat, and I'm going to go ahead and go into the whys of that, at least in my theory, next. One of the things FF10 really tried to do, damn it, 10.2 tried to do, is be funny. Now, anybody who has ever worked in humor at all, ever, probably knows that humor is the hardest thing to write ever. Really, there's no joke here, ironically enough. Humor is so subjective and so dependent not just on the recipient, but the time at which the recipient receives it, their relative environment, their mood. There are so many variables between that go on between the source of the humor and the recipient of the humor that affect it. And so, doing good humor is always a terrible risk, especially in a video game. Now, I say that because, let's be honest with ourselves, video game people tend to be more picky than other people. This is just kind of our nature, I think. I don't think that's actually a bad thing. I think it can be a bad thing when it goes too far, but I am a picky person. I've admitted this before. And personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with that as long as I do it within moderation. So I didn't find 10 too funny. I mentioned I was going to get into this earlier because I do like the kind of silly, random bad humor of like Dragon Quest or the Mario RPGs. But 10-2 did have a few moments that made me laugh. I admit that. I remember that. But overall, it wasn't funny to me. Now, I don't actually know anybody personally who actually did find the comedy of the game humorous. I imagine there are people, because that's how humor works. But one of the things I do think they did wrong, because I will never call an attempt at humor wrong. That would be stupid. It would be like saying someone's opinion is wrong. No, it doesn't work that way. But one thing I do think they did wrong was trying to emphasize the humor side of the game too much. I understand the concept of trying to be lighthearted. Lighthearted does not necessarily mean humorous. You can be lighthearted. You can be open. You can be free with your presentation, with your directing style, with your dialogue, without having to resort to making a joke in every scene, or at least every other scene. You don't have to do that. I think they emphasized the humor part of the game too much. The last game in the Final Fantasy series that actually tried to be humorous was Final Fantasy V. Now, obviously, I do actually like that game. In fact, it's one of my favorites, and I did enjoy the humor in that. But that was in my opinion, there's a good reason that hasn't been done since then. And it is also worth noting that Final Fantasy V had an extremely serious and very dark setting and story behind it, and indeed had, in my opinion, the single most evil villain of the entire series in the back of it. So even they hadn't emphasized it to the extent that 10-2 did. So that's my second gripe, and I apologize if this sounds like I'm really ragging on this game. I just feel it's worth explaining and elaborating not only my opinion, but trying to shed some light for people as to why it is that some people view this game as bad. Because it did have flaws. It had significant flaws. However, there is a reason I have a 159-hour save game for this game. Now, the first reason, and I am going to mention this first because some of you out there might be wondering, how the heck? Final Fantasy X-2 has something that every RPG ever, in my opinion, should have. And I mean, I want to stress the 100% there, okay? All of them. A New Game Plus. And if you don't know what that is, go look up Chrono Trigger really quick. New Game Plus is a feature that, again, I want to stress this because this is very important, should be in every RPG. It should be optional in every RPG ever. PC, console, handheld, whatever. Let me give you an example of a game that I think really would benefit from New Game Plus, just right off the top of my head. Pokemon. Any of them. Any of the actual RPGs, obviously. Imagine what kind of enhancements that would make to the gameplay for people who do want to collect a large amount of Pokemon, but don't want to sit in every single zone and every single town for several hours getting them all. Well, with the New Game Plus, they could loop the game several times, couldn't they? They wouldn't have to go pause the game and pause the story or plot. I know some of the old ones didn't have much, but there was one, in order to grind, basically. Now, of course, if you still wanted to grind, you still wanted to pause, you still could. That's the benefit of New Game Plus being optional in such a matter. And also, it would enable you to, say, for example, catch them all, or at least as many as you're capable of, then start over with your entire team. Even if they're all level 1 or something like that, you would still have your favorite Pokemon right there right off the top of bat. Anybody out there who enjoys Pokemon, I'd love to hear your comments on this one, because I think that would work, right? 10-2 had New Game Plus. Boom, right there, automatically that game gets a thumbs up from me. More, I mean, obviously, I'm kidding. That's I'm not that binary, but that was a huge plus in its favor. And the reason the save game, finally getting back to it, is so large is because it saves your save time. For example, each time through the game, it was getting to the point where it was about 5 hours, give or take. Yeah, that was pretty fast, admittedly, but going a full cycle through the game was about 5 hours or whatever, and then you'd save. But when you start over again, instead of being at 0 hours like most New Game Pluses do, Chrono Trigger, for example, it would say 5 hours. So the save game stacks. So I spent a total of 159 hours playing that game, and granted, I haven't picked it up again, and I probably will someday. I felt the mood, and I'll get into why in a moment. But by itself, that was a huge benefit to the game. Second thing, the game is actually very aesthetically pleasing, all things considered. And I'm not talking about the girls. Don't go into that. While everything I talked about the art design and the presentation, while it was, in my opinion, not good for the presentation of the story and the setting, from the perspective of a game, it was enjoyable to see, the relatively cartoonish, garish lighting, contrasting colors, that sort of thing, and having, the UE features like the race with the people doing the little animated run, or the rather well designed menu, which is in contrast to FF10's rather bland color blend, was actually this little foil dark color. I don't know what to describe it as, but it was cool, right? I liked it. There was a degree of cool factor to the visual presentation of the game. Definitely in favor on that. And one of the things I also liked was that most of the effects, in addition to, of course, the FF10 spell effects, which were recycled, several of the effects of the game actually did look nice, and I do think that's an important thing. I mentioned that back in my FF9 review. I think that's an important aspect of the game. Then, there is also the fact that the structure of the game was completely different from most of the FF series, obviously, but I'm talking about in the structure of the gameplay. And I think it actually worked in its favor in this case. Having what is effectively episodic gameplay, mission based, for example, you don't actually have true freedom, which admittedly I prefer, but I'm going with it because I did actually think it worked well in this case. I think the idea of chopping up everything into these little segments was a good idea. I admittedly would have preferred it if they tied in a little bit better than being basically completely segregated from each other, with a few exceptions, obviously, most of them which are the overall plot and the optional stuff you can do to see the back stuff. But I think it worked. I think it was a good idea. I think that chopping it up like that is it's helpful for anybody who wants to play the game in segments, which I know there's several people out there, and indeed, nowadays I'm basically in that category myself because of real life. But B, it forces your brain to segment the setting and the story and the characters, just as indeed it is being segmented to you. It is being doled out piecemeal, rather than, here's everything. And while I enjoy Here's Everything, I understand very well that most people, at least people that I talk to in person, don't. Because one of the things that people run into in a problem, I've talked about this before when I was talking about Fallout, is they're dropped into a world and it's like, you get a little overwhelmed, right? You don't know where to go because you can go anywhere. And while the Final Fantasy series is a relatively linear game series in such perspective, it has always tried very hard, well, almost always tried very hard, to feel or actually be as open as possible. FF6 would, of course, be the best success, in my opinion, of being the actually most open of the Final Fantasies, because you can pick and choose what you do when, to a greater extent than most people think about. Dicing it up like this, therefore, makes it easier to understand and easier to do. While you do still have options, you can go to these 4 points. It doesn't really matter which order you do these 4 points in, because they're not really connected. Maybe this one's connected to this one, right? There you go, boom, there's the story points. These two have nothing to do with anything other than fleshing out, the setting or getting some rewards or whatever. Okay, that's a lot easier to handle, isn't it? Now, and I don't mean that as an insult, by the way. I really don't. I'm with it. I enjoyed that, even though I prefer the other method. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy this one. And unfortunately, this is probably going to be kind of a short review. I do apologize. But the final thing, and I've been saving this for last, that I really enjoy about 10.2 is the class system. The whole dress spheres and sphere... I suddenly can't think of their name. The plates, which, you put the spheres on, and then you move around the plate to make stuff. That whole system I really enjoyed, and I also really enjoyed the combat. I'll get to that separately. I've said before that I've always been a fan of class system. Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy V, and Final Fantasy Tactics are three excellent examples of what I'm talking about if you don't know. I really enjoy that type of gameplay. Ogre Battle would actually be another good example. I really enjoy that gameplay. I don't actually have a good way of explaining why, other than the fact that it's a halfway point between total customization, like say Final Fantasy X or 7 we're reaching for, and still being restricted in what you could do, like Final Fantasy 6 or Final Fantasy 4. Well, that's a bad example. 4 or 8. There we go. That's a better one. So it's a nice in-between point, and I really enjoy whenever it's pulled off well. And I actually really enjoyed the way they did it in 10-2. Granted, some of the outfits needed some help, in my opinion. I thought they were going a little bit too far over the edge there, but that is my opinion, and that's just a kind of a separate thing. I just felt like mentioning that. I did really enjoy being able to level up, the alchemist, for example, and then use their abilities in order to augment something else. It's just I loved the combination. I loved the system. I loved the way it performed. I loved the way it was presented. I do overall think that that was a net positive, a huge net positive, and one of the things I enjoyed most about the game, one of the reasons I kept replaying through it was because not only was I leveling up all the classes and mastering them and getting all the, whatever they were called, they weren't grids, were they? Because the grid was in 10. What was that called? It doesn't matter. But mastering all that thing and going through was so enjoyable that I didn't mind. It never felt like a grind. And as I mentioned in my, or at least as I alluded to, one of the things I prefer to do to grind in a game that has New Game Plus is just cycle through it several times. I don't stop and level in Chrono Trigger. I just play through again. Alright, I've gotten to the end. Save, New Game Plus. Alright, let's keep going. I hit level 50. Go. Because I enjoy that. And I know I'm not alone in that one, too. And so really enjoyed that aspect of the game. And if you're someone out there who's wondering about whether or not to play this game, in all honesty, I think that whether or not you enjoy this gameplay, the class mechanics and the switching between, which I really should go into more detail, but I will in a second, that's basically, I think, what your enjoyment of this game is going to hinge upon. The gameplay, rather than the story or the setting, the characters, because all those are frankly lacking. They're not bad. Well, okay, and there are a couple exceptions that, in my opinion, are just plain bad. But with the exceptions, it's not all bad. There's just some problems with it, and there's also some cultural problems involved as well. But I'm not even going to get into that, so let's just move on. Like I said, I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail. You can choose your class, of course. You can also choose this little grid thing, right? It's like a plate, okay? Now this plate has a design on it. Let's just say it's a simple diamond. 4 points, right? Okay. Now you put warrior here, thief here, black mage here, and white mage here. Okay. Now you equip this plate. You don't, and you pick your class obviously at the moment. But the point is, what you're equipping is the plate, and you say, okay, I am a warrior at the moment. All right, no problem. So when you go into combat, you're a warrior. Now in combat, you can say, I want to switch up here, and you'll switch up here, and you'll become a what did I say, thief for the top one, and this line will now be lit up. Now if you completely fill out the image on a plate, you'll get some bonus for it, and the bonus is very wildly, and can be very interesting, can be kind of mundane, but it adds a nice little layer to it, I think. It added another aspect to the tactics and strategy of it, at least, especially early on. Later on, obviously, once you've mastered anything, you're just you kind of good and you're ready to go. But it was a very enjoyable aspect of the tactics of the situation. On top of that is the fact that when you there are certain classes that you can only access if you do this. These are the special ones, which basically get rid of the other two party members and turn you into this monster doom thing, for lack of a better term. Those were actually kind of underpowered, but that's not the point, if that makes any sense. If I wanted to be powerful, I'd use the super dress spheres, the Moogle, the Katshi, or however you pronounce that, and the Cactrot, or Cactar. Oh no, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was a Tonberry, wasn't it? Anyways, I'm such a geek sometimes, aren't I? Those three, if you want to be the most powerful, if you're doing the optional stuff, those three are the way to go. If you're just trying to have fun, then picking these super spheres, or super grids, I should say, so you turn into the giant Lotus Death Machine, is just a lot of fun. You get a lot of fun, cool, nifty little abilities. You get a couple more extra attacks than around, and they all look very visually fantastic and stuff like that. It's just an enjoyable experience, and I like that because it wasn't really optimal from a min-maxing perspective, which is something I try to get away from unless I have to. I'm very good at min-maxing. I just don't like doing it, if that makes any sense. But it was very enjoyable from a enjoying the game perspective. Now, I was going to talk about the combat. I don't want to go too much into detail about the actual mechanics of the combat engine and how they actually coded this out. But one of the things that the Final Fantasy series has been doing since 4 is trying to get more towards the ATB method, okay? I talked about this as I was going through the series. FF1, 2, and 3 were all strictly turn-based, not counting the remakes, obviously. And FF10, which is the exception, was purely, again, strictly turn-based. And just to really define it, for anybody who's still uncertain, if I'm fighting this allergy relief pill bottle, because, damn it, I want my allergies relieved! If I'm fighting this pill bottle, and it is my turn, and I'm ready to select something, and I decide to go up and get a sandwich, time is frozen until I decide to make my turn. There is nothing in the world that will keep this going. Now, all the animations are still... I'm still standing there like, I'm going to get you, and the battle's still going, yeah, you're not going to get me. But the point is, this is turn-based, is the fact that everything is just frozen here. ATB is basically the exact opposite of that. When my turn's up, I select something, but the overall timers, there's 3 layers of timers. No, I don't want to go into the code of it. The point is, time is still moving on. So if I get up to go to a sandwich, his turns are still coming on. So he's like, while I'm going up and getting a sandwich, unless I pause the game because, I have a brain. My point is that I like the ATB system, obviously. But 2 of the games have really gone above and beyond to make that ATB system fluid. Very fluid. 8 and 10.2, believe it or not. I'll talk about 10.2 specifically here. One of the things they would do is you'd get your turn up, and there was a sort of a built-in window, for lack of a better way to put it. Again, this is actually rather complicated, but I love the way they coded this. Because, for example, if I get Yuna and Riku's turn up right here, and I select attack, and a second, maybe half a second later, Payne's turn comes up, I had to think of her name, and I select attack as well, the 2 are already starting their attack animation, and then it will actually resolve the actual hit, which is the part that actually matters, while Payne is going up and attacking. Now, if all 3 hit at the same time, you'll actually get this bonus hit. And you may wonder, how can they hit at the same time? Because the game will actually stagger the animations such that the whole combat seems fluid, even though it's turn-based, or rather ATB-based. It is basically fully active time, except for the fact that you're using a menu to give commands, and the battle will move around, too, as a result of that. So it looks very fluid. One of the things, too, is that will affect the enemies, too. For example, let's say little pill bottle here selects attack me with his turn, and I select attack him. I get up to him, and I manage to get off my attack first, for whatever reason, and there's several variables that go into this, again, not going into it. And I get my attack first. So my point is, Pill Bottle is actually readying back, ready to swing at me as I'm coming up, and I hit him, and I literally interrupt his turn, even though he technically went first, because of the dice basically went in my favor. You follow me? And so while it is still the same ATB in the surface, it is so much more, I hate to keep using this word, it's so much more fluid, it's so much more animated, it feels so much more alive of combat, and there's one other very important variable here. It is very quick. Everything is going on. All right, boom. An average fight in 10.2, even when I'm low level and I haven't New Game Plus 20 times. I never actually got up to 20, but you get the point. Even a brand new game, you generally last, 30 seconds in a fight at the high end. Sometimes it could last more like 5. And I think that was very much in its favor because it kept that pace going. It kept the action element of the thing going. And that was one of the things I really did enjoy about the presentation of the gameplay and the combat would just, it would just come and go and come, and it would just be like, and it kept this pace up that made it enjoyable. It made it more, for lack of a better term, action-y. I know that's not a word. So between the beautifully fluid and animated and alive methodology which they presented the combat, the actual gameplay that went into the class selection, and the way you pick your accessories and your plate grid thing, and the overall fact that the game was very aesthetically pleasing from an artistic perspective. I really did enjoy playing 10-2, and like I said, I probably will play it again sometime. Unfortunately, I don't have much else to add. I mean, I could go into details about some of the things, but there's actually one other thing I want to go into really quick. There is one scene, two scenes, I'm sorry, in the whole game that I feel were spot on. In the whole game, these are scenes that I just don't have any complaint over. Well, I shouldn't say scenes, because one of them is stretched out over several, but you find out what happened with Payne, Nuge, and the other guys um, before the game began. And you find out all the complexities of the politics that were going on at the time, the betrayals that were happening, and them encountering what was left of Shuyin and the possession and all that stuff. All of that was extremely well done. It was very tense. It was very suspenseful. It maintained a very successful mystery aspect for a good portion of the game, I might add. You don't actually find out about Shuyin or who or what's going on, or indeed make the connection for some time into the game. So I thought that was very well accomplished, and definitely kudos on that one. The second is what most people refer to when they think of positive things about this game, which is Yuna's speech, which is sometimes referred to as the "I don't like your plan, it sucks" speech. In all honesty, while that was a little cheesy the way she said it, I really liked that, and I really liked her reasoning too. And it was the one and only moment in the game that I felt Yuna was actually behaving as Yuna rather than whatever was masquerading in her clothes for the last several hours, in her skin or whatever. But I felt that actually was very Yuna, and I really liked that, and I really liked the fact that she was demonstrating how Final Fantasy X really did affect her. Because I'm sorry, you cannot go through something like you did in FF10 and simply walk it off. I understand that the portrayal may have been attempted to say that she was attempting to walk it off by faking it throughout 10 too, but I personally prefer the example to be given when someone is impacted by something horrible and something traumatic happening to them. And so her discussing about how she was tired of cutting edges, and how she was tired of accepting sacrifices, and dealing with what was possible rather than what should happen, what was right. I really enjoyed that, and I really thought that was very telling, and again very in character. So props to them. And then that was immediately ruined by the giant moth monster. But anyways, and okay, you know what? Every one of these reviews, you'll notice I haven't been doing this in the normal structure because, again, I don't think this is a Final Fantasy. But there's one thing I do have to comment on. In all of these, I've been talking about the last boss and the villain and the music and a couple other tidbits, right? I'm not going to talk about the music. I'm not going to talk about the villain any past what I already did. The last boss. It's really saying something when you take the last boss of Final Fantasy X, an otherwise rather good game, and make it pathetic, right? I talked about that in my last review. And then you somehow manage to trump yourself by having an even more pathetic, even less interesting, less everything final boss. Now, granted, I have a weird perspective on final bosses. I've always felt that the final boss of a game should be special, should be exceptional, should be unique, should be something either in terms of the code or the mechanics or the presentation, whatever. You should do something special for the final boss because it's the final boss. I feel that that by itself deserves special mention and special exemption. That's just me. And I've talked about this before. Shuyin, I suppose you could say was a special exemption because it's another example of the you can't lose fight. You cannot lose that fight. Now, actually, I shouldn't say that with 100% certainty because I imagine some people somewhere might have figured out a way to actually lose that fight. But I don't know. I know of no such way. I actually put the controller down for a while just to watch, and nope. Um, and it doesn't help that there's no. There was no impact behind it. Climbing our way up the Vegnagun moth thing was okay. And granted, I've always had a problem with games where they build up and build up and build up the super mega, oh my gosh, this is the most powerful thing ever. And then you destroy it in 3 rounds of combat that last 20 seconds each. That does kind of take the punch out of it. And 10-2 is not unique in that. Several video games into that. Breath of Fire 3 comes to mind immediately. But anyways, so the moment was already kind of ruined, and as you're demolishing this thing and you get to the top, and he's playing the freaking keyboard, and then he hops down and he starts hitting you for nothing, even though it doesn't matter because you cannot lose. I don't know. It just lacked everything that a final boss should be. That felt like a tutorial boss, in all honesty. And when your last boss feels like the what should be the tutorial boss, which isn't even technically the first boss, and I don't mean technically. I mean there is a difference in my mind between tutorial boss and first boss. Let me give you an example. In FF8, Ifrit was the tutorial boss, but I can't think of his name. The spider mech thing was the actual first boss. So Ifrit was tutorial, mech was first boss. I might have said that wrong because I'm kind of tired. I apologize. In FF6, Welk, or whatever it was called in the remake, tutorial boss. Vargas, first boss. Okay, you with me? Shuyin was the tutorial boss in that. What? So I apologize. I didn't want to end on a sour note. So you know what? Let's talk about one last thing that I've been kind of saving in my pocket here. One of the things I do like about 10.2 is the fact that how do I put this? The interesting elements of the story, admittedly, there are not many, but they're optional. With a very few exceptions, all of the interesting background and lore and story are optional. And I really like that because there are people like me who will strive forward to get every little tidbit about the background and the setting and the characters that they can because I love that stuff. I crave that stuff. It's juice, you know. It's like juice. Sorry, I probably misquoted him. And anybody who gets that reference gets a cookie. By the way, it gets like 3 cookies. Um, but on top of that, there are, I have to be understanding about the fact that I don't want to ram down what I want in a game down anyone else's throats any more than I want what other people want in a game ram down mine. I've always been a very big proponent of optional within a video game, especially within this particular medium, because there's such a wide audience. Even with a game that has a relatively small consumer base. Granted, the Final Fantasy series is not a good example of that, but you get the point, still has a great variety of opinion there within. The mere fact that as I've been doing these reviews, I've had people tell me that FF2 was their favorite, or FF8 was their favorite, or FF9 was their favorite, or FF12 was their favorite, proves my point rather solidly. And this is just a tiny little fragment of the actual consumer base of the game. So, I like the fact that if you wanted to, you could go learn more, but if you didn't have to. I think a lot more games should have that, and this ties back into that episodic thing I mentioned. If you have episodic gameplay, it's much easier to see, oh, this is something that's optional. I don't have to do it. And if you don't want to do it because you don't enjoy it, or you don't want to do it because you don't want to, you just want to get on with the game, or maybe you don't care about the rewards, or maybe you don't want to learn about, what tragic past happened to Unuj or whatever, done. And I really enjoy that. And so overall, I do recommend 10.2, probably on sale, to be honest, especially nowadays. But honestly, if you're not going to get into the combat and the gameplay, then I probably would tell you to stay away because the story is lacking. Not bad, but lacking, very decisively lacking, and that is why I have a hard time really discussing this game with anybody, because most people I know loathe the game with every fiber of their beings, and they refuse to listen to most of my points about why I do actually enjoy the game. But anyways, this was in fact a little longer than I thought. I apologize. Hopefully you can forgive me for that. I'm gonna go and soothe my throat. I'm not used to talking for this long. Go figure. Have a happy holidays, guys.